That's okay. Nothing wrong with busy days, right?
Yeah, how's the dark side?
It's uh, it's stressful, but in a different way. You know, it's you know, it's, nothing will be as stressful as those campaign days, though. So,
Well,
it was good training.
Yeah, and as long as we always remember who our real client is,
Yep.
it's not easy, but it mollifies it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I missed a call this evening because I was with him, and so I just said.
That's Will Cousineau and Mike McClain talking about the dark side of politics and how it's easier to do if you know who your real client is. Pretty fascinating stuff that's being revealed in the ongoing corruption case against former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and longtime confidant Michael McClain, facing 23 federal charges of bribery and racketeering and more. Well, he's on trial, facing these allegations in a Chicago federal courtroom. And Jim Talamonti, reporter for the Center Square, he's been tracking this since day one with jury selection and all of the testimony that's been going on. So looking forward to hearing. Good morning. Tell us, your takeaway from being a week in the trial this week.
Yeah, well, good morning, Greg. It's we had kind of a short week because Wednesdays, Judge John Robert Blakey, the presiding judge, has said that's an afternoon where everyone gets out early, or at least the jury does, so the jurors can attend to personal business. And then Fridays are always days off, except during jury selection and deliberations. And the judge let everyone out early for Halloween yesterday at more than 2 hours, actually almost 3 hours early, and everyone pretty much skedaddled out of there as soon as he did. There wasn't any significant attorney discussion as we've had at times during lunch breaks. In fact, the lunch breaks have sometimes gone long because attorneys have been bringing things up. The jury wasn't even seated yesterday morning till well after 10 o'clock. Attorneys were going over, and the judge likes to get this stuff out of the way to try to expedite matters so that it's not happening. There are ideally, he would say fewer objections and sidebars when the jury is seated and when testimonies are happening. But some of these things have pushed well into the day or past the lunch break at times. So it's a week when it seemed like, even though it was a week where we were there each day, there wasn't as much. Will Cousineau took the stand Tuesday afternoon, and he's still on the stand going into Monday morning with cross-examination. So we had a lot from him. There was one point when his voice started to break a little bit. We weren't sure if he was losing his voice, those of us covering this, or if he was getting a little bit emotional talking about some of his time working in Madigan's office. But he's offered a lot of testimony. I don't know if there's anything earth-shaking, but just giving us an inside look at a lot of these dealings involving Madigan, McClain, ComEd. We're starting to get into some of the AT&T stuff now, which we hadn't up to this point. So that's going to be another fascinating angle to this.
Well, and
it's not just one utility.
And what's interesting there, Jim, this, from my understanding, is only focused on ComEd, and the AT&T stuff's happening separately. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have so far. Like I say, he started to touch on a little bit of the. There were a couple of recordings that involved AT&T related legislation, which played yesterday, well into the afternoon yesterday, and so there started to be a little bit of discussion of that. And actually, it was interesting that the defense during the lunch break, specifically Dan Collins, one of Madigan's defense attorneys, he's got at least 5 on his team, and not including himself, and he's been quite involved in reading things over, but and going over things. But they brought up the idea of bringing up other legislation. The defense had wanted to keep focus narrow in certain areas, but when it came to other pieces of legislation, Collins specifically brought up what he called Marriage Equality Act, and it seemed like he really wanted to get it in that Madigan was behind this. Not clear at all how this was related to any of the other issues that were being discussed, but it seemed to me, and this was just my impression coming out, that perhaps Collins wanted to kind of curry favor with jurors, perhaps by making sure to mention that Madigan was a proponent, was a supporter of quote unquote marriage equality. There was no objection from prosecution when he did that. It was very brief, and then he moved on to other things.
But there have been other instances of the litigants here making some comments that the judge is like, hold on a second, you can't be making these comments in front of the jury like this, and you're questioning.
Yes, Patrick Cotter at the end of the Tom O'Neill. Tom O'Neill was the former ComEd exec, legal counsel. He was a witness in the ComEd 4 case, and he was on the stand for a good 2 full days of court time. And at the very end of Patrick Cotter, who's who's McClain's lead defense attorney, of his cross-examination, you could see Cotter was getting a little bit testy, and then after O'Neill gave a response, Cotter made a statement, essentially his view, his opinion of things, and immediately the judge, with more animus than we've seen from him at any time during all of these proceedings, immediately said sidebar, and you could kind of see, we couldn't hear what he was telling the attorneys, nor could the jury hear, nor the witness O'Neill, but you could see there was a scolding happening from Judge Blakey, who's been very patient with these attorneys. I think, at least in my book, I would, but he was clearly delivering a message to Patrick Cotter, and I suspect to some of the other attorneys as well. But in particular, Cotter in this case, I think Blakey felt was out of line, and that this was speculation on Cotter's part. And so there have been other discussions, like especially yesterday morning. The attorneys from both sides were in the courtroom at 8:30, and their discussions of some of these issues went till past 10 o'clock. And there were a couple of motions filed by the defense, which Judge Blakey overruled in terms of where the prosecution could go with some of their questioning. And so a lot of inside baseball, as the judge called it, but good news for the prosecution that they were not restricted quite as much as the defense wanted them to be restricted with their lines of questioning.
We're talking with Jim Talamonti, reporter for the Center Square, covering the corruption trial against former Illinois House Speaker and co-defendant Mike McClain. Obviously, this is all about more than $1 million in do-nothing jobs and contracts for Madigan Associates in exchange for currying favorable legislation through the General Assembly, as Madigan had the power as not just the House Speaker, but he could also dangle political funds because he was director of the Democratic Party of Illinois from 1998 till 2021. How much is that coming into this? Because we've heard a lot of different names brought up in some of these tapes, right? Former State Representative Mike Zaleski, former State Representative Kelly Cassidy, current State Representative Bob Rita, people in penalty boxes, or people who might be a problem down the road, or people who wouldn't necessarily be loyal to our friend, our boss, Mike Madigan. So how much is that playing into this, and what do you think the jurors are getting out of it?
It's starting to play more and more, and it's interesting. Zaleski's name came up, even though he really isn't as involved as some of the other names you mentioned. But Kuznets talked about him as, you could tell, a guy that Kuznets really liked, was a good guy, a good trooper was the word he used. But somehow he got on Madigan's bad side and was, as McClain put it, in the penalty box, even though Kuznets felt he could be helpful with gaming legislation that Rita sponsored that they were discussing at the time. Cassidy, once 2018, 2019 rolled around, when sexual harassment a claim came up against Madigan aide and staffer Kevin Quinn, she at that point stood up to Madigan, and McClain, in one of the recordings, and in what sounds like a very threatening tone, said, well, she better be careful. She's going to end up in another hemisphere if she's not careful. And this was in a conversation with Kuznets, and Quinn's name came up, this being Kevin Quinn. A lot of Quinns. Marty Quinn, another Madigan ally, Chicago alderman, Kevin Quinn, working for Madigan, and now his name comes up in that, as it's apparent he's losing his job because of the sexual harassment allegation made by another Democratic Party staffer, Elena Hampton, who we're expecting to hear from. Prosecutor said Monday. We'll see if it happens Monday or Tuesday. But so now Quinn, it's apparent in the light of everything going on Me Too wise, and the Me Too movement, Cassidy and a group of, I think it was 18 other legislators, quote unquote, standing up and saying we need a full investigation. Their way of standing up to Madigan. This would eventually lead to them trying to challenge him, his speakership, and so now what's happening is McClain is trying to line up work for Quinn, who's losing his job with Madigan, but lining up what sounds very much like, as you just pointed to, Greg, jobs do nothing jobs. And well, Kuznow's reply was, well, Kuznow at this point has left working for Madigan, is working for a lobbying firm, which I believe he still works for, Brownstone.
But even then, Jim, I mean, the conversations that McClain had with Kushnow was, this is easier if you know who your real boss is.
Exactly.
Right?
Oh, yes. We have to keep in mind who the, quote, real client is. Our friend. These are terms used to describe Madigan because McClain doesn't want to say the name Madigan or the speaker. He had detailed in an earlier call who's someone who worked for ComEd in a coffee shop, was overheard by Madigan's daughter referring continually to the speaker, and that ComEd person lost her job 2 weeks later. And so, having said that, though, McClain in one of these recordings talking about the Quinn situation slipped up and said Madigan, Madigan.
And I want to play here just a moment. You may not hear this down the line, but I believe this is evidence number 168, where I believe Kushnow and McClain are talking about lining something up for Quinn, and listeners will hear this, and Jim, I'll kind of reiterate once it's done here. And let me make sure that I've got this turned up where it needs to go, and got tons of buttons here. Hit this one there. Okay, and fire away.
I tell them that what I'd like to do is I'd like to keep the people that know this real small.
Okay.
So, and so if they feel like they have to have a board meeting, then just kind of withdraw it, because the more people know, it's too easy for people to babble. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. I agree.
So if they're gonna, if you feel like they're gonna say, I'm helping Mike Madigan out by hiring one of his former employees, and I just should not go there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yep. No, I get it.
So again, the conversation there was McClain talking with Kushnow, saying if you're in these conversations and they're like, well, we need to have a board meeting about it, maybe just drop it. Because people like to babble, and somebody could say this is to help Mike Madigan, and Kushnow's like, yeah, no, totally get it. So there's obviously this recognition that is a possible characterization some could say, and if it comes up, just drop it. He seemed to indicate. I mean, this is pretty revealing stuff.
It is. A lot of these tapes are really, the recordings have been impactful, and you look around the courtroom and you see some reaction, in particular McClain at times, even though he's been through this with ComEd 4 and was convicted in that case, he looks uncomfortable at times. Madigan, as you'd expect, steely, just pretty much stone-faced. But in one of the recordings, Kushnow is saying, as McClain is essentially proposing a do-nothing job for Kevin Quinn, Kushnow is saying, hey, wait, I can use this guy. I need help. I'm double booked. He can help me. Whereas McClain had suggested, well, he can compile reports, or sounds like more like a list of state reps and senators and even city council members and their quote unquote sugar daddies. So there was some response around the courtroom and the overflow room after that. So again, shady sounding stuff, right? The jury will have to decide legality or illegality, right? But
because
Kushnow's trying to actually do something. Yeah, he's trying to get him something legitimate. And McClain's asking for more money than Kushnow can provide, and Kushnow's trying to actually he becomes kind of a sympathetic figure on the stand in the light of the way you hear McClain talking to him. So it's not helpful to McClain.
Kushnow is a cooperating witness in this. He's cooperating with prosecutors with immunity. So I think that's pretty telling as well. But clearly, the defense do they seem to be making their points that this is just politics as usual, job recommendations are just politics as usual, and this is part of the give and take of what we expect our legislative leaders to be doing.
in the cross with O'Neill, yes, they could see them pushing it, and you can see that's going to be a big part of it. Was in the opening statements, and it's I'm sure going to be when we get to the end of this in the closing arguments. And they did with O'Neill. They haven't yet. Dan Collins is cross-examining Kuzhinow, and I think especially on the McClain side, we'll see that pushed even more than on the Madigan side. And we have seen in a little bit of the last two crosses with the last two witnesses that there's been some attempt by the Madigan team to say, well, this was McClain. He's acting in the interest of the speaker, but not at the orders of the speaker. So he's doing this to please Madigan, but it's not Madigan telling him to. So there's definitely been some effort to separate the two on the part of the Madigan team. And I think that's another key angle for Madigan's side, especially knowing that McClain was convicted in the other case. But hey, they're two separate defendants here for a reason. This guy's doing this stuff, and but it's not like we have, again, we don't. It's not orders from Madigan. It's McClain acting on his own to please Madigan, right? So whereas McClain's side would of course differ with that. So you can see there's been some frustration, especially on the McClain team, though, hearing these recordings, because they definitely don't paint a pretty picture of McClain.
Well, there's tons going on, obviously. A lot of names involved here. A lesson for you, I'm sure, in criminal proceedings of this magnitude, as we're expecting weeks more of this. Next week, of course, more witnesses. Kind of a weird schedule with Election Day, Tuesday, and then we start getting closer to the holidays. Jim will be watching your reporting at thecentersquare.com.
Yeah, a lot of big key witnesses coming up. Lena Hampton next week. At some point, we're going to get Eddie Acevedo. Fidel Marquez, key ComEd executive, is going to be one of the big ones. And eventually some juicy stuff from former Chicago Alderman Danny Solis. So there's a lot of stuff to come.
Tons. All right, well, Jim, take care. We'll talk to you soon. It is Illinois in Focus Daily. I'm Greg Bishop. Be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and get the podcast anywhere you get podcasts for Illinois in Focus Daily.